Dear spectators, it's my privilege to welcome Professor Dorothy Figuera, who is a professor of comparative literature at the University of Georgia, USA. She was trained in theology at Harvard, and as a comparatist, she is interested in Western as well as Indian knowledge systems in general and literatures in particular. She is a prolific writer, and she has authored quite a few books which are of immense interest, particularly for us in India. These books include Translating the Orient, The Exotic, A Decadent Quest, Aryans, Jews and Brahmins, Otherwise Occupied, Theories and Pedagogy or Alterity. Moreover, she has edited Cybernetic Ghosts, and recently she has worked on theatres in the round. She is the recipient of Fulbright Grants to India and has been the past president of International Comparative Literature Association. Equally interesting it is for us to note that she has worked on the translations of Gita and Avigyan Shakuntalam, which constituted as an important and integral part of her two books that I mentioned earlier. She is currently editor of the very important journal that's called as Literary Research. She is a prolific speaker and author of numerous scholarly articles on literary criticism in particular and comparative literature also. Today we are very fortunate to have you, Professor Figuera, with us, and she would be speaking on translating Gita. That's the topic with a question mark, which means it includes not translating Gita also. In our studios we have our colleagues from the school as well as some research scholars, and they would be interacting with Professor Figuera after her talk. My privilege to welcome you, Professor Figuera.
Thank you so much, Avadesh. What I find so fantastic is the fact that without even reading my paper or hearing my paper, you've already told everyone the conclusions of my paper. It is really this question of translation and how an image of India continues to be projected into the Western world that sometimes has something to do with texts and sometimes has nothing to do with texts. I'm not a I am a translator. I don't translate a lot. I'm a literature student or professor, and as everyone knows, reading is an act of translation. So it's from that perspective that I'll be speaking to you about translations of the Gita, initial translations of the Gita in the West. And then I'll be going on and talking to you about some other more recent reappropriations of the Gita. Indian studies scholars have claimed that the Western scholarly reception of the Bhagavad Gita contributed to the refusal on the part of the Western philosophical establishment to take India seriously. Indeed, the Hindu Song of the Lord has had a varied and controversial life in the West. In its own context, the Gita promotes devotion to Lord Krishna, the mystical bond between the devotee and the Godhead, and a philosophy of action, karma, and knowledge, jnana. It was the first Sanskrit text translated and published in the West, spawning commentaries by August Wilhelm Schlegel, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and Hegel. It also provided a battle hymn for various nationalist causes. More recently, the Gita made a splash on stage in Satyagraha, an opera by the American composer Philip Glass. In this discussion, I'd like to outline for you today the initial Western reception of this Hindu sacred text. In a previous publication, as Professor Singh noted, I suggested that the search for models in an Indian exotic ultimately collides with a vision of fatalism that certain Europeans projected onto a fictive India or read into its literature. Today I'd like to expand this inquiry by also examining more recent appropriations of this emblematic Sanskrit text and focus primarily on Glass's opera. I question whether the early reception of the Gita resonates in modern political and artistic representations. In 1785, Charles Wilkins translated the Gita from Sanskrit into English. Wilkins' rendition was the most important Sanskrit philosophical translation of its time, determining the view of Indian philosophy that European intellectuals would initially form. August Wilhelm Schlegel then published in 1823 the Sanskrit text of the Gita along with a Latin translation, of which the French Sanskritist Langlois wrote a scathing review. Wilhelm von Humboldt subsequently responded to this review with an essay on the Gita. Humboldt, who also knew Sanskrit, there were just a handful of people who knew Sanskrit at this time, but Humboldt was one of them, gave a rather straightforward reading of the poem. He recognized that the Gita taught the performance of actions without any regard for their fruit. Humboldt elucidated how the god Krishna teaches the warrior Arjuna that truth cannot be found by means of discourse or reason, but by preparing the mind, purifying it, and directing the spirit to the point in which the self connects with things as part of them. Two paths thus present themselves. One can proceed in accordance with reason or thought, or through action, or through action. Both methods aim at the transformation of human nature into godly nature, and as Humboldt rightly noted, this goal cannot be obtained merely through intellectual exercise. So in that case, that initial translation was more or less the way I would teach the Gita to my elementary students in Sanskrit in the States. Straightforward, not too complex, not getting into the problems of Samkhya or yoga, none of those very, very difficult things that to teach. Humboldt's exposition of the Gita did not escape Hegel's notice. The philosopher had initially discounted Indian thought, but now realized that he had to address what he perceived as the negative influence of romantic Indomania. Hegel interpreted the Gita's message that the individual soul must recognize its intrinsic identity with the universal as a call to immobility and inaction. He based his entire analysis largely on the translation of the term yoga. Now, Wilkins had glossed it as the application of the mind in spiritual matters and the performance of religious ceremonies. Wilkins dealt with a problem such as the term yoga by giving us a nice footnote that elaborated. Schlegel had translated yoga by the Latin term devotio, from which we get the English devotion. Hegel, however, opted for the German term Vertiefung, and this meant absorption. He explained this by saying that Wilkins' gloss was too unwieldy, and Schlegel's translation he found inadequate. But Hegel's difficulty in finding an adequate translation for the term yoga was not just semantic quibbling. It stemmed rather from problems that he had with the very issue of the impossibility of translation itself. That translation does grave injustice to terms that are sacrosanct in their own context. Now, whereas Humboldt had focused on the loss of philosophical depth and exactitude, as well as on the aesthetic parameters of associative links, contextual values, and the non-translatability of worldviews, Hegel held that meaning is not transferable and original theoretical meaning is of necessity lost. Thus, the practice of translation in general posed a fundamental epistemological problem for Hegel. It is impossible to render a term such as yoga into German, he maintained, because the concept did not exist in German culture and religion. One cannot demand that an expression in a source language with its specific mentality and culture be rendered by a corresponding expression in a target language. This is what Hegel maintained. Humboldt, like Herder before him, had eschewed any temptation to compare. His universalism rejected arguments of commensurability. Humboldt therefore avoided setting any value judgments on Indian philosophy in his discussion of the Gita. Hegel, however, was all about value judgments, especially when some system of thought threatened his own. You have to understand that what Hegel is doing here, first he wants to ignore India altogether, because it does not fit into this Hegelian vision of the history of philosophy, which of course culminates in Hegel. Then he realizes with all these Sanskritists working, all these Western Sanskritists working so hard, he has to do something about it. So he reads the Gita. And he reads it very carefully so that he can prove his already prejudgment regarding India. Now, I can in my book, when I wrote on this, I focused exactly on how he totally leaves out the other half of some important karika. He leaves out verses. He drops important words. He drops negatives. He does all sorts of strange things to basically make a vision of the Gita that's going to support his philosophy, because if he has to deal with India, he's going to make it meaningless. He's going to make it unimportant. And numerous philosophers have said, this is where we had the beginning of this refusal to take Indian philosophy seriously. As an aside, because I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but it's quite amazing that you cannot study India in a philosophy department in the United States, or perhaps even in Western Europe. They don't. India is seen in a religion department. It might be seen in an English department, in English translation. But there's never a course on Indian philosophy. It's not viewed as philosophy. It's viewed as religion. So even the concept of the teaching of philosophy does not acknowledge that India has those 6 philosophical systems. It's quite astonishing. And the philosophers, certain scholars, have left this at the door of Hegel, that Hegel set this in motion. Okay, so to go back, the discussion concerning the inadequacy of translating the term yoga led Hegel to postulate a theory concerning translation that claimed that it was impossible due to the incommensurability of the source and target languages. Schlegel and Humboldt had crafted translations that retained a certain context-dependent semantic variants. While both shared Hegel's belief that language mirrored the soul of a nation, a very German idea, and could not perfectly be communicated, Schlegel and Humboldt found an answer to untranslatability in refractive translation, whereby a complex expression in a source language is rendered according to context by various expressions in the target language, and thus allowing the many-sidedness of a term to be grasped. Hence, we find in Humboldt and also in Schlegel, when he talks about this, he gives it at any point maybe 6 or 7 different translations to encompass the concept of yoga, all of which are part to basically to give the reader as much information concerning a concept such as yoga in order to make an amalgamation of an idea, of an approximation of what something like yoga must be. Hegel's judgment on the impossibility of translation opens up the possibility of alternative and creative translations. And this is my major point here. So in reading the Gita, Hegel felt unconstrained in offering imprecise or fragmentary renditions that also happened to support a judgment on Indian philosophy that was grounded in a defense of his own philosophical system and supported a vision of Indian fatalism. So his reading of India ended up being no less imaginative or bizarre or fantastic than that of the Romantics, whom he loathed and whom he wanted to debunk. To a certain extent, Hegel set the standard, as I mentioned, for Western philosophy's refusal to engage the Indian other. He justified his stance by developing a theory regarding translation in which foreign texts in general retain very little of their legitimacy. The hermeneutic process, the interpretive process, breaks down, and the reader's prejudices are never called into question, and the text functions as a mold into which these prejudices are then poured. And this brings me to my main topic of my inquiry today: curious 20th century readings of the Gita. Now, I could go on about those early German translations, and then I could go on talking to you also about Victor Cousin, who took Hegel's idea and translated that into French. But that I'll let you go and read my book, The Exotic, for that. What I found very interesting is a general interest of mine is this fabrication, this creation, this building up of an image of India. That is really my field of expertise, if to say so. And I look at these Gita translations in this context. We have a fabrication here of an image of Indian philosophy that is very far removed from what Indians and Westerners now might understand as Indian philosophy. And yet it has an afterlife in the fact that Indian philosophy is still not taught. And we have this image that Indian philosophy teaches nothing but this image of fatalism that some Westerners projected onto India. Okay, so it's once again these projections. What are we projecting of ourselves onto this India that becomes a fantasy that we need to fill some gap in ourselves? Now I'm going into some of these more bizarre, Baroque things that people do with the Gita. And trust me, they are very bizarre. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass over the case of a poor man named Theodor Springmann. And he was translating the Gita into German while he was fighting in the trenches of the First World War. He was literally sitting in the trenches with artillery going over his head, and he was translating the Gita. He finished his translation 2 days before he was blown to smithereens. It's very interesting if you look at his translation of the Gita, because he frames the text to support Germany's imperial designs. If you're in the trenches, you're translating the Gita, you need some meaning to the fact that you're going to die, you find it in the Gita. In Springmann's introduction to his translation, it's a very moving introduction, by the way. Engagement is seen, as he says, the swan song of Aryan knighthood. Mm-hmm. The war itself becomes a matter of dharma. Karma is no longer tied to disinterest, but rather to the patriotic service of a cause. Springmann also brought a Hegelian vision of Indian fatalism to his interpretation of the Gita. So here we have, almost 80 years later, that fatalism is still there. Shortly after completing his translation, I can't remember, it was literally within days, he was killed in action, and he died with the consolation of having performed his duty as a warrior. The other message of the Gita, disinterest with regard to the fruits of one's actions, had somehow eluded him. Okay, let's jump to the next World War. In the next World War, we find this figure. Her name is Savitri Devi. Now, one would think, is this an Indian woman? No. She's a French woman of Greek descent. And she's this rabid French, Greek anti-Semite. And she assumes an Indian persona. And she drew correspondences between Hitlerism and Hinduism. And after the war, she distributed pro-Nazi propaganda in Germany, aided small conventicles of unrepentant Nazis, offered comfort to fugitive concentration camp guards, and performed solitary rituals at Nazi shrines. She was a sort of scary woman, sketchy woman, as we would say. For these acts, she earned a prison sentence, where she was able to pen her interpretations of the Gita. Savitri Devi explained the war in terms of the Gita's vision of periodic cosmic creation and destruction, its philosophy of unattached action, and its teaching regarding the insignificance of human life. She claimed that Hitler had learned his racial theory from the Gita. And she said that Hitler was a yogi in spirit. According to Savitri Devi, Hitler was the one who had spoken in the Gita and had come back. Like Krishna, Hitler dispensed warlike wisdom and promoted the territorial expansion of the hallowed race. Just as Krishna had revealed himself to Arjuna in cosmic form in the Gita, so too, as Savitri Devi tells us, did Hitler appear to her in cosmic form in a Viennese garden of one of her friends. There she saw Hitler merging into the impersonal essence of the many-featured one and speaking Krishna's words. In short, Savitri Devi claimed that God was reborn as Hitler, an incarnation of Vishnu and a savior of the world. The only manner in which Hitler differed from his previous incarnation as Krishna in the Gita was that, and this I find very bizarre, was that he proved to be too lenient with his enemies. Now, of course, this is a very scary woman. It's a very scary episode. Had Savitri Devi been some alienated member of a lunatic fringe that was circulating around after the war, then her use of the Gita would provide nothing more than a curious historical footnote. The sad truth, however, is that she continued to be an active Nazi polemicist up until she died in 1983. So she's still a Nazi in 1983, and she still published, and she's been cited in recent years by neo-pagans, skinheads, Nazi metal music fans, and neo-fascists. In fact, she's become a leading light in the international neo-Nazi underground of Holocaust deniers, hollow earth theorists, and Nazi UFO enthusiasts. Now, you probably don't even know that these people exist, but they do exist, and they're very active on the internet. And this is where I came across Savitri Devi. Her anti-Semitic rantings and excerpts from her books appear on numerous racist and occult websites. So, a general search regarding the Gita on the internet can quickly pull up her interpretation of the text. And because she has this Indian persona and name, an uninformed reader can mistakenly take her for an Indian and can take her reading for the Gita as something authoritative or authentically Indian. And if you pull up a website under the Bhagavad Gita with her name attached, you think you might be getting something legitimate or a legitimate Indian interpretation of the text. And this is what I found absolutely fantastic. The internet being the way it is, I have my students. We're reading the Gita. Of course, what do students do when you have a text? They don't buy the book. They don't want to read it. They start reading it. It's too difficult. It's unpleasant. They go to the internet. And this is how I found out of the existence. I said, Savitri Devi, who is this Indian woman? And then I looked into her, and then I found her books, and I got them through interlibrary loan, and I realized it's this crazy Nazi stuff. But the reality is that a student who doesn't know any better, an ignorant student, some 17-year-old kid from the deep south or from the Midwest who's never heard of India might really think that the Indians were Nazis or that Krishna, I don't know what kind of conclusion one can draw, but it's astonishing. And what was very interesting is when I spoke about this, I remember speaking about this once with a colleague who did Russian literature, and he says, Savitri Devi, I know her. We can find her cited by Chechens. So other nationalist groups are picking up this material. So among the violent fringe groups we find circulating in the world, this legitimate reading, this quote, legitimate reading of the Gita is picked up, and she becomes an authority. Rather than just a crazy woman, she becomes someone is still reading many years after she wrote this stuff. And that I found absolutely astonishing. So we have to think in these translations about their afterlives. You make a mistake in a translation, it can haunt a text for a century to come. So I also mentioned her translation of the Gita to highlight the extent to which a text can be distorted once it is unmoored from its context and language. And not that I say Hegel gave us Savitri Devi. I doubt that very much. But his allowing, his theory that cultures cannot be translated, or that cultures are uncommensurate, or that we can do grave injustices to texts, allows us to do these grave injustices. Such, quote, translations can lead to gross misappropriations in the realm of ideology. And that's the case of Savitri Devi and art. And that will be in the case of Philip Glass's rendering of the Gita in his opera Satyagraha. Now this opera, Philip Glass is a modernist American composer. This opera was premiered in 1979, and it deals with Gandhi's development of a philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. And as such, it merits our attention today, the day after Gandhi Jayanti, I think. The entire libretto consists of 20 excerpted verses from the Bhagavad Gita. It was the task of Glass's librettist, a woman by the name of Constance de Jong, to cull selections that she felt were appropriate to reflect the action depicted in the opera. The composer and his librettist chose to keep the text in Sanskrit because they found its sound to be evocative. Unfortunately, de Jong distorted the Sanskrit by subjecting it to a non-standard transliteration from the Devanagari script. She claimed that she learned Sanskrit, but in 2 months, well, she must be a genius. She learned Sanskrit in 2 months, and she learned it only in transliteration. So we wonder what kind of Sanskrit she understands. And then, so she transliterates it bizarrely. And then she further altered it by imposing on the text a very unstandardized pronunciation guide for these singers to sing. She told them how to pronounce the Sanskrit in ways that are not sort of canonical. Even if one knows Sanskrit, it would be very, very difficult to follow this libretto. Glass claims that he was inspired to write this opera by an interest in Gandhi, particularly his early professional life in South Africa, where he developed the civil disobedience movement as a response to the discrimination Indians suffered there. However, Glass's understanding of Gandhi is not historically objective. Rather, it's colored by biographical myths that were propagated both by acolytes of Gandhi and by Gandhi himself. Glass chose to devote an opera to Gandhi because he felt the Mahatma had provided the inspiration for all subsequent dissident groups. Moreover, Glass felt that Gandhi's legacy lives on, and even claimed, and this is the problem I have, this is the point I have a big problem. He even claimed that Gandhi's mantle of effective militancy has been taken up by contemporary artists in the West. So it's quite an outrageous claim. Gandhi lives on in artists like me. That's basically what Glass is saying. Glass frames his opera on a central myth of Gandhi hagiography, namely his successful career in South Africa. According to the standard script of this myth, Gandhi, motivated by compassion for the suffering of the poor and disenfranchised, sought to rectify social injustice. The historical truth, in my understanding, is a bit more nuanced. Before going to South Africa, Gandhi had, to my understanding, no pressing problem with discrimination as codified by the Indian caste system. Only after arriving in Africa and realizing that there was a color bar imposed on all non-Europeans, there did the fight against social injustice become his cause. Satyagraha arose as a movement only when Gandhi himself experienced color prejudice for the first time. In reality, Gandhi actually achieved very little for his 20 years of militancy in South Africa. He secured a never-fulfilled promise of protection for well-educated Indians already living there, and the possibility of entry for other high-caste, well-educated Indians like himself. Unfortunately, he secured nothing for South Africa's poor Indian laborers. The myth that Gandhi discovered the need for the uplift of the world's poor was a future event. Nevertheless, Glass chooses this myth as the basis of his opera. The opera opens with a battle array represented in the Gita, with the two main armies of cousins facing each other. Duryodhana and Arjuna appear in chariots at the center. Behind them stands Krishna, posing as Arjuna's charioteer. Gandhi is situated between the warring factions, and he begins singing Krishna's words, to which Arjuna responds. In effect, God, in the form of Krishna, is rendered silent and replaced by Gandhi. The libretto then jumps back and forth between Gita citations articulating Arjuna's, and here we must say Gandhi's, moment of doubt and weakness, and Krishna's answers that are sung by a chorus made up of Europeans and Indians. Scene 2 takes place in 1910 on the Tolstoy farm, an agrarian collective Gandhi founded, and then jumps back in Scene 3 to 1906, when Gandhi vowed to resist the Black Act that required Indians to carry identification cards. Act 2 moves even further back in time to 1899 and begins with Gandhi's return to Durban after a visit to India, where he's accosted by South African ruffians. We then jump forward in Scene 2 to 1906 and Gandhi's founding of the newspaper Indian Opinion, set to Gita verses, whose relevance is at best tangential. That's the other issue. We have this action, and then we have the text is the Gita, and the text has nothing to do with the action. Doesn't even slightly touch upon the action. The action proper of this scene is meant to depict the printing and distribution of the paper. The final scene then jumps ahead to 1908 and the burning of the identification cards in protest of the Black Act. Act 3 moves the action even further forward to the Newcastle March of 1913, and here the set is again the battlefield scene of the Gita, where Gandhi tries to persuade South African miners to join the strike against discriminatory immigration treatment. The opera ends with Gandhi alone on stage, with Martin Luther King suspended in the air, looking on. Glancing upward at Martin Luther King, Gandhi sings Krishna's words. In other words, Glass has Gandhi acknowledge himself as an incarnation of God. Throughout the opera, in one act we have Martin Luther King floating in the air, sort of propped up, hanging up on some sort of strings. In another act we have Tolstoy hanging up in the air, and then in another act we have Tagore. Mm-hmm. So it's quite interesting how they all merge into people having influence on each other. I personally can't speak too much for the music of Glass's opera. I don't know how, you're probably not familiar with Glass's opera. It's very, very, very postmodern. It's not, but the nice thing about it, it's not jarring. It's not awful sounding, largely because Glass's music is very minimalist. It consists of, as numerous critics have noted, of simple arpeggios, repetitions, and scraps of very basic melody, and then just scales. Glass aims to strip music of its instrumental component, melody, harmony, and rhythm, and scrutinize each through a repetitive process of slow repetition. These concerns are partially obviated in his shift to opera, where Glass needed a less stagnant approach to harmony. Repetition is still to be found here, but now it outlines chord progressions rather than a static atmosphere. In my estimation, the music is far less unpleasant than the banality of the opera's message, its inchoate appropriation of the Gita, its fanciful depiction of the historical record, and its pretentiousness. A particularly negative review by a music critic named Kenneth Fury encapsulates the opera's overarching thematic. All you need to know from this opera is that Gandhi was good, oppression is bad, and there was some connection somehow between Gandhi and Martin Luther King. This critic saw the opera as a bald instance of marketing. And indeed, the text, as culled from the Gita and arranged by De Jong, does seem platitudinous and prescriptive. Fury, that critic, also found the operatic scenario, a sequence of non-chronological tableaux, ineffective. Another critic was more dismissive. He simply found the opera to be a travesty. As much as I'd like to criticize Glass's venture, we must realize that this opera is not as radical as it might first seem. Granted, Glass takes historical material and mythologizes it. But mythologization of history is common to opera, as in the case of Bellini's I Puritani and Donizetti's Anna Bolena or Maria Stuarta, these historical operas. As a medium, opera is self-consciously a myth-making enterprise. So Glass's mythologization of Gandhi's career is not without precedence. Nor are Glass's fanciful motifs in any way extraordinary. As an art form, opera deliberately and ostentatiously brackets off reality. It was only with bel canto that opera drew away from the realm of the marvelous, mythological, and fantastic. And it is only with 20th century verismo that anything close to realism was depicted on the operatic stage. While De Jong's manipulation of the text is irksome, incomprehensible libretti are not unknown in languages far more understandable to the opera-going public than Sanskrit. If you go to an Italian opera, you can't understand the Italian. If you go to a German opera, you can't understand the German. By the 1750s, Italian opera was largely incomprehensible, with an emphasis placed on vocal displays and vocal acrobatics. That the audience of Satyagraha cannot understand the libretto is not an exceptional occurrence. What is interesting is that the Sanskrit verses chosen for the libretto, even if understood, do not illuminate the action. In fact, Glass never intended for the Gita libretto to be understood or even reflect the opera's plot. He says so. The Gita is evoked for its exoticism, just like the Sanskrit is evoked for its exoticism, not for meaning. In last year's production at the Metropolitan Opera, the translation of the Sanskrit did not even appear in superscript. Only occasional English summaries of the lyrics were projected. You have to understand that if you go to an opera house in the West, since people can't understand the German or the Italian, above the stage is a running superscript. And so people can follow the opera even if they don't know the story of the opera. But they didn't even do this. It would be natural to do this, but they chose not to. They chose to keep the text totally opaque. Nevertheless, any philosophical reservations one might have about the liberties taken by Glass and De Jong with the historical record and with the Sanskrit text fade into obscurity when one views Achim Freier's 1983 Stuttgart production of Satyagraha. In this production, the battlefield of the Gita becomes a circus filled with absurd props, trapeze artists, and a Gandhi who holds a huge barbell that bends to the floor while he sings, tripping about under its weight. Tolstoy Farm is presented as a dystopia with rags on the floor, where the actors move aimlessly, reposition ladders, and run in place to somehow depict Gandhi's vow of civil disobedience. Freier's second act opens in a bar with dwarves serving drinks from cocktail shakers and crawling menacingly after Gandhi. In the next scene, set in the newspaper office, students busily write on blackboards serious German words such as Einsamkeit, Wort, Vernunft, while Gandhi leaps about. Eventually he sits down and shows the pupils alphabet cards, and then the children begin marching about with the letters on poles, and then they stand behind each other, moving their multiple arms like a Shiva Nataraj, or dancing with the letters folded like airplanes. The final act does not portray the Newcastle March of 1913, but rather the March to the Sea that took place in 1930, decades after Gandhi's South African sojourn. A blue electric snowman with a dove over his head wheels in as a finale, and an army of zombie-like figures in slow motion advance amidst blinding red lights, Nazi costumed guards and police dogs. Freier's production concludes with what can only be called an Assumption scene, with Gandhi covered in blood backing up a staircase to a long series of endless arpeggios. He looks rather like Jesus from a distance with a Sacred Heart, framed by a round stained glass window. This self-conscious and studied spectacle fittingly closes with Gandhi's name misspelled in the credits. Even if we acknowledge that opera as an art form is licensed to entertain both the irrational and the hysterical, we can safely conclude that with Freier's production, it enters the realm of kitsch. To conclude, this brief overview has shown us how the early Western reception of the Gita introduced several hermeneutical problems involved in engaging the other. In their initial translations and commentaries, Schlegel, Humboldt, and Hegel questioned how philosophical thought could be understood outside its own tradition. In contrast to Schlegel and Humboldt, Hegel foreclosed the very possibility of such understanding when he rejected the notion of a common universal meaning and inflicted the standards and methodological apparatus of one culture, his own, upon another, Indian culture. The impossibility of reading the other with a European mode of understanding results in nothing more than an appropriation and colonization of the other, since the hermeneutical project has been aborted. We've also seen how the resulting lacuna can subsequently be filled in by popular notions of the esoteric and occult East. Delectation with some dominant fiction or master narrative can ultimately be more gratifying than understanding. Savitri Devi and Philip Glass both exhibit this impulse. For them, the Gita did not function as itself, but rather as an exotic tool. Savitri Devi read the Gita as she did in an effort to justify her devotion to Hitler and his cause. Glass's appropriation is far more complex. Glass's opera is performed in a language more removed from audience comprehension than most operas. The text was left in its original Sanskrit because the composer found it evocative. His librettist distorted it further through incorrect transliteration and phraseology. Glass and de Jong neither respected the text they used nor the language in which it was written. Let's not forget that the Gita is charismatic, and from a Hindu point of view, its appearance on an operatic stage is as inappropriate as the use of biblical stories once was considered unacceptable. However, there is a major difference between Satyagraha and operas that use the Bible, such as Strauss's Salome, or Saint-Saëns' Samson et Dalila, or Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. These operas appropriated and deformed biblical stories, not the religious text itself. I doubt very much that Glass would have chosen to write an opera using the Quran in this fashion. In Glass's exoticism, the Gita is used as a colorful prop for the composer's reformulation of Gandhi's hagiography. Given its status as a sacred text performed in a sacred language, the Gita adds gravitas, legitimacy, and mystical allure to an otherwise banal operatic plot. Glass has concocted the storyline to support the myth that Gandhi inspired subsequent dissident movements. To this thematic, Glass added his own personal myth that socially conscious artists like himself, and we can assume Constance Jung and Achim Freyer, incarnate the revolutionary spirit of Gandhi in our time. But this exotic myth-making suggests a less radical and, might I say, decadent and exclusionary interpretation. Beginning in the 19th century, India supplied Westerners with an alibi in the true sense of the term, and elsewhere onto which they could project their longings. People who are world-weary or have lost faith can seek in the Indian exotic a new system of belief. They can travel farther from home than the ordinary seeker of truth. Esoteric quests are therefore not egalitarian. They tend to foster elitism. It suits those for whom quotidian experience does not suffice, those who seek the superordinate in order to invest their existence with greater intensity. In other words, it suits zealots, crazy people like Savitri Devi, and artists. Those very individuals believe that while the divine spark is present in us all, not everyone realizes it or is capable of reuniting his or her spark with the divine. Those engaged in a Promethean quest are often attracted to the exotic precisely because of its elitist potential. When Glass and de Jong travel to India on Rockefeller money to explore spirituality in 2-month installments, are they any different from 19th century seekers of the exotic? The situation of Glass and his collaborators is exacerbated by the artistic climate of the late 20th century. Gandhi's world was a much easier place to play the role of a truth seeker. In the postmodern world, such a posture is more problematic since postmodern art consists primarily of pastiche. It takes from the past signifiers and places them randomly as non sequiturs in some new structure. These signifiers function as totemic representations of art. They connote neither meaning nor richness. Such a citation need not be subtle. As evocations of past art, they reference only themselves as aesthetic structures, alerting the reader that he or she is experiencing art. Paradoxically, postmodern art exists in an age that prides itself on discovering identity, respecting the other, and valorizing other cultures. Yet the art itself does not respect culture beyond some facile and often distorted evocation. Outrageousness and shock value trump meaning. The postmodern artist need only produce something that is striking and appears original. My last paragraph. The situation is so dire that in a recent issue of Art Forum, the art historian Carol Armstrong has asked whether we are now so self-absorbed and so unwilling to undertake the effort of historical and other kinds of empathy that we no longer engage with earlier forms of art at all. Her comments bring me back to Hegel. I think we can all agree that Hegel deserved our opprobrium for refusing to make a place for India in world philosophy. And I think we can acknowledge and respect the imperfect attempts of Schlegel and Humboldt to engage Indian religious thought. Theodor Springmann and Savitri Devi clearly needed an alibi in the Indian other for their actions. But how should we read Glass's insertion of himself as an avatar of Gandhi? Are we supposed to accept this self-serving and grandiose equation? And how should we respond to Fryer's trivialization of the Gita in a Cirque du Soleil setting with Gandhi stumbling under barbells, attacked by drunken Nazi dwarves, and singing the Gita to ascending scales in mispronounced Sanskrit? These various readings of the Gita should give us pause. Once the persona of the translator and artist overshadows the text, then it becomes nothing more than a vehicle for their self-reification, and as such, can offer no enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Figuera, for your brilliant insights into the translations of Gita from Charles Wilkins to Philip Glass. That is the last quarter of the 18th century to the present almost. From Gita to Satyagraha of Philip Glass. What interested all of us was the way you took us to the translations of Gita and the way it was used to fulfill certain needs, that certain segments of people, whether they were academicians, real scholars, Indologists, or Nazis or neo-Nazis, they appropriated translations and the way they interpreted for their own purposes in different periods, and that's what wherein we feel that the politics of translation comes in the picture. But in the process, it made a paradigm very clear, and that is when one feels that the Germans, the way they were struggling to translate a term like yoga, then there was need for what we know as to approximate the lexical meaning and to find out the corresponding equivalences in the second stage. And when they were not happy with the corresponding equivalences for translation, like devotio for yoga, then in the end, what one feels is that the concept is used as it is. But when it comes to opera, the concept satyagraha is used. But what one feels is that the connotations and the way they are shown, they are distortions of Gita, as not only Gita but the figures that are used there, be it Tolstoy or others.
What I found so astonishing is we call these initial people Orientalists. We call them exoticists, but they were trying to translate.
Yeah.
They were trying to make sense. And here we have this 20th century self-styled spiritual composer who doesn't even think he has to try to make any sense, and he feels that he can do whatever he wants with a very significant text, and because he's an artist, he's allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And
So
how somehow this becomes a translation.
it was a clear case of misuse of poetic license. We have some of our colleagues and some students here, and they would certainly have many questions, because the way you constructed the whole argument and exposed the politics of translation, if I can use that term, then the questions would be in their minds. They would have observations also. May I request colleagues and other scholars?
Actually, he was talking of the translation of yoga and the exact equivalence, the struggle to find for that. But if we talk in that sense, what is suggested by Lafayette, that if there is any struggle for conceptual grid, that concept should be elaborated, rather translations. So that could be one of the strategies of translation. But what I would like to know from you, your views on that, I think one who in German philosophy, who is very much acquainted with the concept of Gita, and he literally very lucidly presented the concept, that is Immanuel Kant. His concept of duty for the sake of duty is exactly what is represented there in Gita, the theory of karma phal. If I am to say that Hegel's perception is a misrepresentation of Gita, the Kant's presentation and his concept of theory for the duty for the sake of duty is most appropriate translation, or if we can say the perception and reception of Gita.
The point is very valid. In fact, if we look from Hegel to Heidegger, they are very clear in their views. They say that as far as pure philosophy is concerned, pure theory is concerned, and science as value-free system of knowledge, they are typically Western and Greek properties. No other culture has can have or has them. And therefore, even up to the Second World War, they very categorically said that the ultimate fate is Europeanization of the earth. This mindset operates at that particular level. And the appropriation of the concept and use of concept, they were all discussed and used much later, but they have to be seen in a very subtle way, the way by putting different words together and comparing the connotations that differed. I think point is well taken.
Can I just add to? I think the one point I wanted to bring up in terms of Lefebvre was the fact that, isn't it very interesting, the more modern theory of translation is actually what was done in the very first translation of the Gita. So they started out with what we would consider to be a good model for translation, and it went down. It seems to have gone downhill from then.
What impact does it really make on the audience beyond the audience of the source text? Because considering the importance of the text, I think it's very, very important to know your viewpoint on this.
Thank you very much for that question, because that's how I came to study Philip Glass. I normally would not, because it would be a modern opera, and my taste to music don't go toward that, toward modern. But it was the fact that, now they have simulcasts. So you can go to a little movie house anywhere in the world, and you can see the simulcast of the Metropolitan Opera. And so I've taken to going to opera more often than not. And I missed the latest production of last year, but a number of friends went, and they were very moved. And it was that made me say, well, what's happening with this opera? And I asked them about it, and the more I heard about it, the more odd it seemed. But they were very, very moved by the whole thing. And what they were moved by was something that, as I said, was very perhaps un-Indian. And yet they thought they were experiencing something India. They thought they were learning something about India. This is my bugaboo. You think you're learning something about India when in fact you're learning something about a product that's packaged and marketed as India. And that seems to be what's happening. And that seems to be what's happening across the boards. It's happening in the classroom, it's happening in the Indian American fiction we're reading, and it's happening in these artistic representations of India. And it's not only Glass, other artists that do India.
Thank you very much. I can see many hands, but we have run out of our time. We thank Professor Dorothy for your critique of translations and the way Gita and Gandhi, Satyagraha, they are being appropriated, and the way from one medium to another medium the things are done. I think our questions will continue, so will answers even after this session. We thank you, Professor Dorothy, for this, and all the staff for making this occasion possible. Thank you very much.